Okay, everybody, welcome to the second WAESN Round Table, where we're going to be discussing the contents of Module 2, which was about pulling the weeds of white supremacy in the classroom, with special guest Dr. Kinoshita. I'm Tracy Castro-Gill, and I am the Executive Director of Washington Ethnic Studies Now, and I'm mostly going to be moderating, so I'll be watching the Q&A. So if you have questions, put them in the Q&A, and I'll pose them to the panelists. But I'm going to ask the panelists to introduce themselves. I'm just going to call you in the order that you show up on my screen. So first up is Erin.
Hi, I'm Erin Herda. I am a middle school teacher in Tukwila and on the board for Washington Ethnic Studies Now.
Thank you. John.
Hey everybody, I teach in Seattle Public Schools. I am on the board of Washington Ethnic Studies Now, and I also am a youth coordinator for NAACP Youth Council.
I don't know how you remember like which side it's on. I always get confused. Shraddha.
Hi everyone, my name is Shraddha Shirude. I am the Secretary Director of Washington Ethnic Studies Now, and I'm a math teacher at Garfield High School in Seattle.
Kyle.
Hi, I'm Kyle Kinoshita. I appear to be, one of the guest speakers tonight. Thank you, and sorry about the technical glitch. I sort of call myself a recovering administrator because that's what I was. Seattle Public Schools Chief of Curriculum Assessment Instruction, but been a central office person in Marysville and a principal as well, and a huge supporter of Washington Ethnic Studies Now.
Thank you. Amanda.
Hi, y'all. I am Amanda Hubbard. I am president of the board for Washington Ethnic Studies Now, and I'm also an ELD, an English language development teacher at an elementary in Seattle Public Schools.
Thank you. So, like I said, we're going to be talking about the contents of Module 2, which focuses mostly on how whiteness shows up in the classroom and how we can pull those weeds and make space for ethnic studies. It's like a very introductory level module to instruction, and that's the purpose of it. And so I'm just going to go through some questions that I pulled from that module, and then we're going to talk about that and any questions that people put in the chat or anything that just kind of comes up organically from the discussions for the next hour. So yeah. Here we go. In what ways does whiteness show up in education? That's kind of the big question for Module 2. And we use white supremacy culture and the characteristics of white supremacy culture to define that. So how does that show up in education for us?
So Tracy, did you want me to sort of kick the discussion off as a guest speaker? Either way, I'm really glad you said this completely informal, but sometimes also prep for stuff just in case.
Yeah, I think we'll mostly defer to you, and then people will jump in when it's appropriate.
Okay, well, I did prep a little bit of something, and it's just just a couple of minutes just to sort of kick the conversation off, because I watched the last roundtable, and I was so impressed and a little bit intimidated by Dr. Levy, because I said, man, I don't know Dr. Levy, but I do have lots of experience, with the topic, just in terms of experiencing and dealing with and trying to, really combat whiteness. So, what I'll do maybe is I'll share my screen just a little bit, just like Dr. Levy did, but then I'll really kind of open it up to my colleagues that I'm so glad that I'm here with. So anyway, so I thought about this a little bit, and in some ways I said I was a recovering administrator, and that's only half a joke, because of the fact that I have a lot of experience with, you know, being in the weeds, and as an administrator, in some ways, you know, I would have to say that, you know, I'm someone who's was kind of a weed grower just as an administrator, just because of the fact that that's kind of my role. If you take on any kind of school leadership, you know, that's basically what you do. So what I want to do is just introduce this with a couple of ideas. Just first of all, say I wasn't always a weed grower. My history with ethnic studies has been, you know, really goes back a ways because I've been around the block a little bit. And I came out of the 70s as, you know, an activist trying to figure out what to do because I really wanted to figure out, you know, how do you fight racism and capitalism? And so there are lots of things that I did. And these are kind of artifacts. This was one of my first, you know, educational experience with ethnic studies, going to Western Washington University, in that in order to take ethnic studies, we actually had to take over a building in order to preserve the College of Ethnic Studies because it was being cut. If you're aware of Western Washington University, they have Fairhaven and Huxley. Those colleges were going to get increased while ours was going to get cut. And so we had to, you know, basically launch a building takeover to do that. I also wrote for, you know, an Asian youth paper. This was about the My Lai massacre in Vietnam at the time. And I talked about the fact that this really blows up the idea of model minority, the fact that, you know, this system is so racist that not only does it murder Vietnamese civilians, it, you know, allows the perpetrators to get off scot-free. So in any case, you know, that led to all sorts of different activity. And that's, if you look at that picture of another takeover of County Executive Don Spellman's office, that was about the fact that they were also trying to destroy Chinatown as a neighborhood. So the thing with it is that at some point you have to get a job. And so I didn't really know what to do. I thought maybe teaching was one way to get involved in social justice. What I encountered though was, you know, basically a lot of whiteness, and, you know, over the decades tried to figure out how I could cope with it. So for better or for worse, I thought maybe if I went into leadership, I could do something. And yes and no, I guess. The thing that is that if you're in a leadership role, you do have to actually administer kind of the white supremacist role in education. So let's just fast forward, because I want to talk about what it is that folks deal with in terms of education, and spend a lot of time critiquing whiteness. You know, yes, it's a white institution, but it definitely has a real root. What it is that we're dealing with in terms of whiteness really can be traced back to one of the biggest levels of federal intrusion on education in decades. And that, of course, was No Child Left Behind. The reason I talk about that, because if you want to talk about the culture of whiteness and the culture of fear and conservatism around ethnic studies, you can really take it back to here. This supposedly had a social justice veneer, but in fact instituted a system of high-stakes testing, but also, you know, punishment, blame, and shame. Now, in some ways, I call this the ghost of, you know, No Child Left Behind, because a lot of this stuff basically doesn't exist anymore. It's, you know, things that are in the past, but they still have a legacy in terms of, you know, particularly in terms of school leadership, the idea that, you know, you have to be accountable or you'll be subject to punishment. So what that then does, just a sec here, I have to do my cursor, is,
Kyle?
you know,
Could you clarify what you mean about those things? 'Cause you said just now that those things don't exist. Which ones? Because a lot of them, I thought they still did.
well, you know, actually I made a mistake. The one thing that still exists is testing, grades 3 through 8. But all of this stuff about 100% proficiency level, highly qualified teaching force, AYP is gone. Now they have a kindler and gentler form of NCLB called ESSA. You're still subject to that, and you're still subject, particularly if you're a school that has a lot of BIPOC kids, you know, lots of threats of punishment.
Mhm.
But if you're kind of a middle class school, you're pretty much exempt from this anymore. However, you know, I guess the point I'm trying to make is that even though these particular measures don't exist, the culture of fear and conservatism has kind of lived on, even though you
Right.
have a kindler and gentler form of No Child Left Behind. And
But
I
kindler and gentler for like the white schools and the middle, like the middle level schools, but it's still really prominent in the BIPOC schools, the majority BIPOC schools.
Yes, you still have, and I'll talk about this, what kind of exists now.
Mhm.
You still have the requirements to do school improvement plans. You still have to report, you know, through Title I and basically the kind of mechanism set up by OSPI about, you know, what sorts of improvement that you do. So it may not be that you have to do these things down below to where, you know, they'll blow your staff up, which I've seen, you know, 15 years ago, or whether they'll get rid of your principal, which I also saw in some schools, but they will still, you know, again, figure out some way to shame you. It's just that it won't be in this way. But you know, be that as it may, it still, you know, happens. And I think this has been the case of whiteness for all the federal acts around, you know, education. And the fact that they've kind of built in a culture even before this of, you know, the idea of deficit and the idea that the reason why schools don't fail kids is to blame families and the kids themselves. This dates back to a very early part of the century. So in any case, a couple other things. So what you have basically is, you know, the form of whiteness is, you know, this kind of deculturalization that existed for decades. And it's hardwired into the classroom culture. Um, So this is sort of what we are dealing with today. You know, we still have the high stakes testing, which takes a tool which should be something that, you know, actually helps educators keep track of kids and makes it an instrument of reward and punishment. It's an instrument that, you know, that I don't preaching to the choir. It's biased in favor of white middle class cultural norms, and it's blind to the funds of knowledge that kids have. So one more slide, and I think I'll open it up. There is this culture that, you know, sort of dictates that there has to be rigor. You know, there has to be, the curriculum has to be taught, because if we don't, we're shortchanging kids by not giving them standards. And, you know, it's typified by that comment that the Arizona State Superintendent issued as it banned ethnic studies, when in fact, obviously, he could hold a mirror up to himself to pretty much say that, you know, the toxic effects were poisonous to BIPOC kids because of the fact that they had to learn a white history. another article before. This actually showed up a couple days ago in the New York Post, complaining specifically about Seattle public schools. Now, why would an article in the New York Post complain about the Seattle public schools? Because of the fact that, you know, there has been such a big wave of support for ethnic studies, for teaching about race, and, you know, really kind of teaching towards social justice. The big lie is that somehow this means that kids are going to be deprived of an education. But I guess what I would hold is that it's not really, they're not advocating teaching about rigor. They're advocating teaching about whiteness, because we, you know, all of us educators want rigor for BIPOC kids. But the thing it is, we don't want whiteness. So in any case, that's kind of what I, you know, wanted to get off my chest, in that, you know, one of the things that I want to do as I kind of reflect on my career is to try and figure out, how can I help contribute somehow to a model of school leadership that doesn't oppress kids, that figures out a way to resist whiteness, and, you know, figures out a way to actually give kids the education that they need, which is some of the things that we talk about in WAESN. So in any case, that is how whiteness plays out in school leadership. And I think that it's unfortunate that what you're encountering is school leadership that continues to try and cue the school toward this system of, you know, avoiding punishment, and creating a culture of fear that if we don't teach whiteness, we are going to not only be punished, but in many ways, you know, shortchange the kids. So that's my first piece. Maybe later on, I'll talk about my thoughts about how we can resist this. But I'll stop now because I know people have lots of stories.
Tracy, can you read the question just one more time so I'd make sure I'm not accidentally veering us in places we're not ready for?
Yeah, it was just very broad. In what ways does whiteness show up in education? I think Kyle covered a lot of the things that come up in conversation in Module 2 about how it shows up. But if y'all want to talk about ways that you've, you know, specifically encountered it.
And also, I don't know if people caught the applause for what Kyle said. I recorded it, Kyle, so I can play it back for you.
I was, so while Kyle was talking about this, like that article, I was feeling so frustrated because I remember when that came out, and I was conversing about it with you know, educators from all around, not just in Seattle, but I was talking about it with some with one of my friends who works in Michigan and another one who works in Georgia. Like, I was talking about it with a bunch of different educators, and, you know, they just rolled their eyes. And the thing that struck me was that it kind of felt like a little gut punch of like, how, you know, why would he say this? But then we are so trained. My instinct was, when that happens, good or bad, is let me reflect on my teaching. Is this true? And it's not a bad thing, but it's that in that regard, I reflect when somebody criticizes. I reflect and I think. That doesn't happen in our system. It doesn't happen for most white teachers when they are criticized. When, you know, when we criticize the system or we criticize the whiteness, no reflection happens. No one stops and thinks, wait, and then think about what the impacts actually are. I always do that, even when it's coming from some bullshit right-wing person who actually has literally no connection or doesn't even know what actually is happening in our schools. So I started thinking about like my curriculum and what I'm doing. And I just had a department meeting today and was talking to some of the other geometry teachers. And, you know, they were like, oh, well, I'm on unit 4. And I was like, how are you already on unit 4? I'm on unit 2. And then I suddenly felt like I was super behind. And then I asked them what topics they had covered. We have actually covered about the same number of topics, but the way I approach it was much more comprehensive, meaning I included things from I didn't approach it in a linear way, right? So I pulled stuff, I was teaching stuff from the very last unit, and I pulled stuff from the beginning and the stuff that I was calling this unit. And I taught from about 4 different units in my first unit, like the content standards, right? Because without the students knowing all 4 of those things, they wouldn't have been able to complete my project. So my expectations are actually far higher because they cannot complete the work I'm asking them to do. They cannot complete ethnic studies projects without having more information and more knowledge. They need to have rigor because they can't do it without it. But because I don't follow that linear model, suddenly people are thinking, oh, well, Shraddha's geometry class only got through 3 units this year, not recognizing that the unit assessments that I used actually required skills from a bunch of different units. And some people might say that I'm not doing a good job because I'm not teaching them linearly. But if it requires that they understand area to be able to do transformations, and in order to, check that if the transformations are correct, they need to understand congruence. Like, those are things from 4 different units, and I use them in 1. But somehow I look like I'm teaching. I've lowered my standards, or I'm not teaching rigorously because I didn't cover as much material. But what they really are saying is I didn't give as many tests.
What I'm hearing you saying, Shraddha, is that white supremacy characteristic of quantity over quality. And that is so much our default. I think about the way that we charged into this school year. And I think about how, on the one hand, we were positioned as an SPS employee. I felt positioned such that, like, our union fighting for and really trying to problem solve a collective bargain that reflects, like, the size of our district and the needs of our students and educators, and how that was pitted against an unreasonable timeline. And I also feel like, as I've continued to read over the white supremacy characteristics, is that we like to compound these things. We like to combine them for a Mortal Kombat extra special, fuck you to educators and students. I think about how much time they wasted on a reopening plan for when students could be back in schools. No one asked for that. There wasn't the possibility of us returning back to schools was so far away. When they started that work in March, that was the thing that they chose to focus on in March of 2020. And we are now almost a year, and the district has not done any planning or reasonable problem solving around being culturally responsive in this pandemic. And I think about how schools were left to flounder because of this false sense of urgency, when it was we had since March to be planning this. You created this by refusing to acknowledge that we would need this backup plan. That wasn't ever really the backup plan. We needed a plan. And then I also think about how that sense of urgency is almost always paired with either or thinking, because it's you have to do this, because if you don't do this right now, then your other choice is absolute abject failure, and now you're a terrible educator and person, and don't you care about children? How did we get there? How did I get positioned in that point when I was arguing that how are we ready to start because my children don't have the things necessary to start? And somehow now I'm the one who's not thinking about children. And there's this thing that happens, and I don't know if it's liberal Seattle, but there's this thing that happens where we're well, what about equity needs and the students whose needs are not getting met? And people go, oh yeah, And then it's crickets and silence. And then eventually someone's well, we got to do something for the kids who are here, white kids, white parents who have been arguing and sending emails and making phone calls and whatnot, tapping into resources that are just not the same resources that our Black families, our Indigenous families, our POC families are tapping into. And yet we are still being positioned as though somehow these systems that are failing were not managed well by our individual choices.
Also, how dare they like assume, have you noticed all of these like rhetorics around returning to school for equity, for equity? Why are all the white people talking?
Yeah, Bruce just joined us. So Bruce, can you introduce yourself, please?
You're muted, Bruce.
I was sitting there talking. I'm like looking at this group. I'm like, who don't I know? It's like, yeah, this is everybody that I know. I hang out with you guys all the time, so I think you know who I am. Who is there? Anybody new?
Well, we have attendees who aren't part of the panel. So.
Oh. Okay, so Bruce Jackson, Aki Karosi, board member of Washington Ethnic Studies now, currently organizing the Black Lives Matter at School curriculum fair, which could be kind of cool. Hey.
Yeah, if you have a link that you could put in the chat for everyone
Right.
to check that out, that would be nice.
All right, let me get that.
And we're going over the contents of Module 2, which is white supremacy or whiteness in schools. So I want to move on to the next question because I feel like we could stay on this question forever and it's already 6:30. So let's get deeper into the weeds. One question that I ask people to reflect on in Module 2 is what causes you stress about implementing ethnic studies? And I want everybody to answer that, but I also want to let you know 4 of the top things that come up without fail. Lack of support from administrators is always number 1. Racist parents, especially in virtual learning because parents are watching what teachers are teaching. Making mistakes and not knowing enough. Those are like the 4 biggest themes that pop up when I ask people to reflect on that. So you can address one of those or just talk about your own stress. And somebody in the chat just said funding. So I feel like that also falls under lack of support. That may be like lack of support from district administration, right? Versus building administration.
I would say also like a lack of understanding what ethnic studies is from administration. And so that causes a lot of complications when you're trying to move things forward. That just like jumped out at me when you're talking about like financial support. Like I don't have any access to books for my students. Right. Like I have to be, creative in my teacher sharing world to get the materials to my students. And it would be so much nicer if, I was given the books that I need to support my students and given, like the materials needed to support my students.
Can I just add something to this? That might bridge kind of these 2 questions is like whiteness is, I think, one of the biggest barriers in my whiteness. And then also like this whole idea, if you've read some of the work of the teacher activist, who also is Tracy Castro-Gill, talking about, trying to flatten the hierarchies in an ethnic studies class. And just like, when I do that, like I'm also centering like a lot of a predominantly white population. I serve predominantly white population. So you also don't want to kind of empower like this kind of predominant white culture, which is pretty unique at the school I teach at, and just make sure that, they're not taking the steering wheel and taking it places it shouldn't go. So I just feel like just whiteness is like, it's like everywhere you turn, it's like in the staff meeting and for me in my mind and my upbringing, it's just everywhere. I feel like it's a constant process to try to deprogram. And just speaking of deprogram, I feel like I just have to throw this story in and then I'll zip it. But just like with Kyle, like when we met Kyle, because this is also highlighting Kyle, right? Like Kyle did something that was just kind of blew my mind when we met, is like, because, I was coming from this place of like, let's get some ethnic studies to Seattle. How could they not? There's all this great research. They need to check their racism. There's no good reason not to do ethnic studies. And so when we're finally got this opportunity to meet with somebody high up, somebody with positional power, who was Kyle, the way he started the meeting was all relational. Like he got to know us. It wasn't about getting stuff done that first meeting. It was about like building that partnership. And so it just struck me as like, we're running a mile a minute, and like he just like slowed everything down so we could actually build some trust. I feel like there's a lesson there.
And Alexis just joined us. So Alexis, can you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, sorry I'm late. My name is Alexis Buru. I'm a 10th grade at Foster High School and on the advisory board for WAESN and a part of the NAACP Council. She, her pronouns, and
Thank you. Yeah, I'd love to hear, because, you know, I was a district administrator and Kyle was my supervisor, and there was a lot of plotting between the two of us, like trying to navigate the district administration and kind of go around them. And so, you know, a lot of people in these modules will say to me, what do we do about the things that we can't control, like the standardized testing, like the pressure from the admin to increase test scores? You know, one conversation that we had a lot was the CCC curriculum in Seattle Public Schools, which is the K-5 literacy curriculum. And the literacy program manager was telling everybody, teach with fidelity. And Kyle would have to come back and be like, no, that's not actually what you're supposed to do. So what are educators supposed to do when they're put between that rock and the hard place, where they know what they're supposed to be doing, but their administrators are telling them another thing? And that brings me, like, John would always go and testify at school board meetings saying, you're expecting us to be anti-racist, which means you're expecting us to go against our own bosses. So I'd like to hear what Kyle has to say about that.
Well, boy, don't get me started, kind of. But you know, and again, I think there's this false opposite that gets created. You know, the idea that, well, you either have rigor or you have something like ethnic studies. You either have fluff or, you know, you have the real education. And, you know, my take is, and, you know, part of my kind of recovery after administration is, you know, picking up, you know, Paulo Freire again. He talks about rigor. He talks about the fact, yeah, we want to teach kids how to read. But the thing with it is, we also want to teach them something about society and the way it works. So, you know, the CCC is, there are lots of technical parts about it in terms of how you teach reading. So one of the things that, you know, I wanted to do that didn't quite get done was to figure out, how do we substitute, you know, all this slew of white authors, you know, in the materials that they have, with something that, you know, actually, first of all, shows, you know, kids kind of a reflection of who they are. So that's one thing. The other thing is that, okay, fine, we want to teach kids comprehension questions and things like that. In those books that have themes of race in them, why not put some questions in that help them to teach them how to think about more deeply about race, and teach critical thinking around issues of justice and things like that. So, you know, that would be my first thing, is to say, you know, quit this false opposite business. You know, because, yeah, we want to teach literacy, we want to teach math and science and all these other things. It's just that we want to, you know, put it in a context, you know, so that kids can actually see the place of it in society. So that's one thing that I would say. And I think that if you want to think about what a comeback might be to an administrator who's pressuring you in the direction of literacy, I guess that's what I would, you know, have as my number one comeback. You know, not a false opposite. Yeah, I'm about teaching kids too.
I also want to say, like, for white folks who are listening to this, the unfortunate reality is that you have more power and sway over your administrators than educators of color have. Because one reason that book exchange never got finished is because the educators of color in the Ethnic Studies Advisory Group were working on the replacement text, and we were somehow seen as less capable of making those decisions, right? And so it was taken off of our plate. And sent back to the white folks in the literacy department, right? And so it was never accomplished. And so if you identify as a white educator, that's when you need to step in and step up and be like, wait, like, what are we actually doing here? That's your role, right? and call those people out, because when we do it, we're just seen as angry or jaded or unprofessional.
I'll go ahead and throw out the whole situation at the OSPI level right now, right? Like, oh, good, we were finally heard a little bit about the leadership. Okay, great. And then now if we also say, okay, great to have people of color in leadership, but also who is doing the actual work, who's on the team? Is it people who are experts? The reality is no, and it's a lot of white educators. Why are they there? Because they were department heads, because they were instructional coaches. They were the people who were seen as capable, and capable of doing what? Capable of pushing things like CCC, capable of getting high test scores by making sure that the students that they're working with comply. Extra credit for those students who do the reading the fastest. You know, how dare you not wear a belt? Suspended, right? Like, people who upheld the white supremacy norms that we call citizenship, like those are the educators that also moved forward in education. And so to say that, you know, new teachers or teachers of color who've never held positions of power are not capable of making those decisions. Opportunities to actually make change, like what's happening with the OSPI Ethnic Studies Committee.
There were several examples of when district administrators would go to John or Heather, who was another white member of the Ethnic Studies Advisory Group, even though I was the Ethnic Studies Program Manager, right? And go to them for information because they were the white members. And John and Heather would always be like, you shouldn't be talking to us. Like, you should be talking to the educators of color. And so that's when I see the role of white educators in these instances where it feels like it's out of control or out of your control. The white educators have more wiggle room to challenge those things that seem like they're out of control, out of your control, instead of the educators of color. Racist parents, I don't even know what to say about that. I was fortunate when I taught at Denny that my administrator would kind of take that over and just tell parents, this is what we do at Denny. Like, that's just the reality. If you don't have that kind of administrator, I don't know if I have advice, if anybody else wants to add to that.
Yeah. Well, I do have some advice, you know, as someone who was in the system, and part of being in the system is actually learning all the rules so that you can play the game. So, you know, I guess what I would advise is that, you know, again, I hate the fact that standards, say, for example, it has been turned into some sort of high stakes, you know, game, you know, that ends up in punishment. But two can play at this game too. One of the best defenses that you have of knowing policy and knowing standards is to say to parents, hey, excuse me, I know my standards and I know what I'm supposed to teach. And this is actually here in the standards. So, you know, fine, you know, go to my administrator, go to the school board or whatever, because, you know, I'm just doing the standards here. And it, you know, in fact, I'm value adding because, you know, basically I'm teaching deeper about the standards. So in some ways, you know, that can be your shield against the racist parents. You know, the fact that, you know, you can learn these things so that you can have, you know, these little shields, you know, again, that's, you know, one kind of use about learning about, you know, things like standards. Same thing is true about policy. If you know policy pretty well and say, hey, look, you know, I'm just following policy here. And, you know, the thing of it is that the policies pretty much defend my academic freedom, as well as the fact that, you know, it's right here in things like policy 0030 of the Seattle Public Schools to say that, you know, we are going to create more just and more racially aware education. So I guess that's what I would say. Use these tools, against the ones who would attack you.
I totally agree with Kyle's master's tools to dismantle the master's house, if you will. And I would add on that in addition to arming yourself with the knowledge that they're going to come at you with, arm yourself also with your student evidence. I think that is the thing that has been the most successful for me in changing hearts and minds, is being like, okay, I hear you. I totally hear you. Could you read this? Did you know a 9-year-old wrote that? Did you know that like that is what they have reached? That is like the level of thinking that they have reached now. And in a lot of ways, I've adopted Miss Honey from Matilda as a little bit of my role model in like how to negotiate the system, which is like, I know what kind of dog and pony show I am putting on for administrators. I know how to point towards my like standards goal wall, like in ELA today, students will be able to, in social studies, students will be able to, and like all of that is right there. All the props are there. And then when administrators are not there, we can get back to the real work. And the students are more than happy to be co-conspirators with you in that, because they know, they understand like why you're playing the game, because it's not a secret. And like, that's the other piece of it, is that it doesn't need to be a secret battle with the children. Ally them with you, because they deserve that education, and they know they deserve it as soon as they understand what it is that you're trying to convince them they need.
And
at least elementary.
Just for context, yeah, thank you. What grades do you work with? Because a lot of people say, well, you can do that in high school, but what grades do you work with?
Last year I worked K through 5, but the majority of my experience is 3rd through 5th. And what I would say is like the main thing within primary grades, when you're talking about 5, 6, 7-year-olds, a lot of it is just giving them the tools and the vocabulary and language to talk about the world that they're seeing. It's not about indoctrinating them. It's not even necessarily about critical thinking, although it can be once you get there, but that's not usually till like after March, because y'all, there's so much about teaching how to do school before the littles can do it at all. And so you give them like the words that they care about so that they can talk about it in the ways that you're going to help facilitate. And then for the older kids, y'all, they are so ready. They're so hungry. They feel all those emotions. You've met, preteens. They have all the emotion and they're starting to enter into the hormones, and they have a lot of questions and demands. But when they feel empowered, when they feel like you're letting them in on the secret of why the world is the way it is, then they're 100,000% on board. They're ready to do it, and they don't moan about having to write about it. They're like, are we gonna have time to write about this? Are we gonna have time to talk? But if I do this, are we gonna have time to talk though? And like they know, they're invested. They know what they want, because now you're exposing them to things that they didn't even know that they wanted, but they deserve.
Mm-hmm.
I was just gonna add a little tidbit on top of it, what Kyle said earlier, like not even as dramatic as Amanda, but if you're really struggling, go ahead and throw in those, statements of support or statements of commitment that every single district in America throughout this year, being like, no, we love our Black and brown students. Just throw that in there. You can throw from OSPI, from all around every single education system somewhere in your state said in one way or the other that they support Black and brown students. Go ahead and just throw that at the parents and be like, here's the contact information if you need to let the person who wrote this know what your complaints are, and you can, feel free to include my name. You're fine.
So we have a question from an attendee or participant. And I was going to try to steer us in this direction and talk about networking and community, but the question is, how did you find people to start this branch of the organization within your building and or district?
Could you repeat that again, Tracy, that question?
Yeah. How did you find people to start? I'm assuming Chelsea means WAESN. How did we find people to start WAESN? Did we find them within our building and our district?
Mhm. If you don't mind, I guess since I'm the guest speaker, I'd like to kind of talk to that one. I'm going to share one more slide, which I think is really kind of the heart of the matter. Let's see. And what I think one of the best defenses is a good offense in a way, in the sense that I think what folks have to do, first of all, is to kind of arm themselves with a counter narrative. The counter narrative to the idea that achievement is about teaching to the test, right? By the way, I highly recommend this book because it has a whole chapter on, the research around ethnic studies. And the fact that, the ultimate irony is that if you teach ethnic studies curriculum, BIPOC kids engage, very deeply in learning because of the fact that they see themselves in the curriculum. And the fact that, Christine Sleater talks about the fact that college going increases, GPA increases, reading awareness, comprehension, and even the idea of engaging in subjects like math increases. But of course, that's not the only reason we teach it. I guess I would say that's the ultimate irony, is that if you don't teach to the test, you end up achieving and all these other measures. But the most important thing, however, is that, as I say, kids reach and achieve their humanity, which is the most important thing. And, the thing that I'll talk about with Ferreira, he talks about, you want to teach all subjects to a high level, but the central thing is a critical reflection on society. So, I think one of the first things you do in your collaboration is arm yourself with knowledge. That's the basis of your collaboration. So that's one of the things I sort of wanted to get off my chest, sort of, as what I think that we have to do is develop that counter narrative, is that, yeah, we're all about student achievement. If we want students to achieve, we would do things like ethnic studies. The other thing, by the way, John, I'm glad you talked about relationships. I guess I hadn't thought about it, but you're absolutely right. I think that, that probably is a story in of itself, how we started, because, I was a top administrator. I saw that the superintendent said, okay, Kyle, do something about ethnic studies because you're the curriculum guy. And so Seattle being Seattle, I started out by doing it in an incredibly, policy-driven kind of white way. And, that didn't go over too well. But, I thought that, yes, the real thing is to create the relationship. And that's the whole power of it, of what I would say that is your best defense and your best weapon in terms of advancing ethnic studies, is to create those strong relationships. Because quite frankly, I have not seen a district yet that has moved ethnic studies without the support of the community, without the student voice, without teachers being unified around it. Yes, it's helpful to have, a guy kind of on the inside, but quite frankly, that guy is not going to be effective unless you have those relationships, on the outside.
John, you've been waiting to say something.
Oh, this whole idea of rigor, I feel like maybe I heard it from Wayne now, of just like how we are just so, and it's part of those characteristics of white supremacy culture about the written word, how, that's the only thing that's valued. And I just think about the text of our world being so ripe for analysis, but that doesn't get the same value as like Shakespeare does. And the whole irony, another irony, maybe not the ultimate irony, is just that, of course, ending racism is going to be challenging. It's going to be challenging for everybody. So this idea that that's not rigorous, like this country's never not known racism. So that would be like the hardest thing ever. So, and then also I just like to highlight, like having taught some of those advanced learners is like when you bring up, which is predominantly, you know, white and wealthy, and they don't seem so smart when you ask them about racism. So like, obvious, that's just no, you could just poke so many holes in this idea that ethnic studies is not rigorous. I mean, maybe just because they haven't figured it out, they don't think it is, but of course it's rigorous. The biggest question of your time.
I want to go back to the question though. This group was started, well, let me back up. I want to say, there are people out there looking for community, but you have to put yourself out there to be found and to find other people, because that's how we came together, right? John put himself out there in the community and he partnered with the NAACP. He put himself out there with the union, and that's how he and I got connected. And then I started putting myself out there, and I connected with a bunch of other people. And so this group was founded by a group of educators across different school districts in Western Washington who were looking for that community. We were all out there looking for it. And we knew that we weren't going to push this very far if we weren't working outside, not only outside of our classrooms, but outside of our district and going out and making a push at the state level. And so we were fortunate enough to have Dr. Curtis Acosta come out and kind of kickstart us and bring it, you know, because he brought people with him with his name. And then we just grew from there, and we, you know, we brought our own experiences and our knowledge of what we need and what we struggle with, and decided to make this a place to support other people who are experiencing the same things as us. So I hope that answers.
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, I was the only person teaching ethnic studies in Tukwila. And it wasn't until I was connected with Tracy that I even got my department to sign on to teaching ethnic studies. And then the only way I got connected with Washington Ethnic Studies now, I came when I was invited, right? I showed up when I was invited, and some days it was like, it's Sunday at 10, and I showed up. Because every time I left one of those meetings, I felt better. I felt supported. I felt so, you know, like I can go and I can move things now. And now I feel like I'm almost like not abusing my power, but now I'm very vocal in all of the spaces that I'm in, and pushing back on all of these ideas. And I don't think I would have been that person if I had not been involved with WAESN.
Like on a small level, I just started by asking my students, like, what, who are the good teachers? Tell me about those teachers. And then I heard about a couple of teachers at my school. They all happened to tell me the same thing, that they're doing ethnic studies. And I was like, okay, I need to learn more about this. So I did some reading, found out about Wayne Au, and then I found this group through Facebook. Deadass, like that's what I did, is I found people through Facebook, started making connections, heard about Tracy, went and talked to her. Like, I had to advocate for myself. No one is handing you this. No one is forcing you to teach ethnic studies, because if you're being forced to teach ethnic studies, you are not ready. If you want this change, you have to make it a lifestyle shift. And that's how you get involved, and that's how you join these things. I've heard lots of people complain that they feel left out of these groups. No one is saying don't join us. We want everybody on board, but you're not going to be forced to join, and you aren't going to be handheld. Like, no one is going to like show you the way. You have to carve your path, because ethnic studies is about identity, about relationship, and about the ways that you show up in this world. And so no one's going to give you the right way to do it. You have to forge it, and you have to forge your own path, and know that here at WAESN, we have a space to help you do that. But this is really a you journey.
So we have about 5 minutes left because we started a little late. And I'm going to put Alexis on the hot seat right now because the other two themes that emerged from people sharing about what stressed them out about implementing ethnic studies is making mistakes and not knowing it enough as educators. And so I want to hear from a student's perspective what it's like if you've ever experienced a teacher share with you their mistake and share with you their learning process, and what that felt like to you. And if not, if like no teacher has ever done that with you, how do you feel about teachers? Do you think that that would be helpful?
Yeah, so I would say, as far as ethnic studies, I've never been taught an ethnic studies class. And when I was at Showalter, where Miss Hurtis teaches, I didn't really know what ethnic studies was. I just knew that that's what she called her class. And I was like, oh, I guess that's just what she called her class. But I was in social studies. And so for the longest time, like she was just the only one that I knew and the only one that was like really recognized who taught ethnic studies. And then once I started like obviously learning what ethnic studies was and just being in these spaces and all this stuff, like I was like, oh, that's interesting. Like Miss Herda, she was a real one for like, you know, standing her ground, because why should she be the only one teaching ethnic studies when, anyway, you guys get the point. So that was the first thing that I wanted to say. And then as far as like not knowing how to teach it, or not knowing how to making mistakes, I think I have been in situations where like teachers are like very open, like I make mistakes. And it was I guess comforting, because like throughout the year it would just become a thing where like no one was expected to be perfect. And I think that was important as far as, you know, being in a classroom and learning. And so there's also times where it's not necessarily like a thing where a teacher would be like open and say like, oh, teachers make mistakes, but like I personally like could see like, or someone, an example was one time in like choir class, we were doing something and I don't know what was happening, but our teacher was like doing this one exercise and it wasn't really working. We weren't really getting it. And then he was like, okay, well, thank you guys for trying. Like that didn't work out. And so it was just super like cool for me to see like, oh, like he's, you know, just trying things out. And it was like a super small moment, but that in and of itself was really like, I don't know, I just always remember that. And so I feel like that's kind of the same theme where even when you are trying something new, you don't know what will happen, it's still worthwhile to like acknowledge that, you know, trial and error type of thing. And so the same thing with ethnic studies. Obviously there's like more weight to it and there's more responsibility when it comes to teaching ethnic studies, but as long as you are open and like you have the sense of responsibility, but also knowing that like you won't be perfect and like acknowledging that and like making that space you know, an open and welcoming space in that type of sense, I think is it's all good. Did I answer all your questions?
Yes, thank you. Any final thoughts, Bruce? We haven't heard a lot from you. Any final thoughts on what we talked about today? I had other questions, but we ran out of time. Let me land it on this last one. Who and what do you put in your ethnic studies garden and why? That's one thing we talk about in module 2. Who and what's in your garden and why?
Oh, that's me. Yeah, I don't know, kids. Yeah, the reason I started this thing is because, you know, I was in a social studies class and they asked a kid who Martin Luther King was, and he said Martin Luther King freed the slaves, and I was like, if you're speaking in a metaphorical sense, yeah, kinda, but that's so wrong in so many different ways. And then he's like, well, who else would have done it? And we had this long discussion about Martin Luther King and what Martin Luther King did, and it was so limited at that time. And now we're planning questions that kids can ask for the rest of their lives and figure out who they are by asking those questions. And that's what, man, the ethnic studies is opening eyes in a way that it's never done before. And Aki is so much better because of it. I mean, we walked down the hallway, there were times when African kids wouldn't talk to Black kids because they thought they were inferior. And now you're starting to hear histories of Africa and mixing it with American stories. And now that they understand that this is a construct that can be broken, there's amazing things that are being discussed in our classrooms now. And I don't want kids anywhere in this country not to feel the way kids at Aki are starting to feel, and don't want them not to have the tools that they have. So what do I have in my garden? Every kid that comes through Aki is a seed that needs to be planted and grown. So that's where I'm at.
As usual, Bruce, like, he finished for us. We're done. We don't have anything else to say. Bruce kind of just wrapped it up nice and neatly for us. And so make sure that you check out our website. Erin mentioned the PLCs, the professional learning communities. That's one place to learn, whether you're new to ethnic studies or a veteran to ethnic studies. The next one is January 26th, 4:30 to 3:30, and you can register on our registration page. The professional development modules, which is where we're pulling the content from for these roundtables. And we'll have another roundtable in February where we cover like an introduction to ethnic studies, which is module 3. And we're working on the guest speaker for that. And we'll announce that through our social media channels, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at WA Ethnic Studies for all of those. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you all
Thank
so
you.
much. Have a
Bye.
good night.
Have a good night.
Thanks, y'all. Bye.